And without further ado, I'll introduce Crispin.
3 pages later.
It's very short, nice and concise. So Crispin Elsted is a poet, essayist, translator, designer, and compositor. With his wife, Jan, he is owner and publisher of the Barbarian Press in Mission, BC, which he publishes limited edition letterpress books, many of which have won awards for design. As well as being a writer, he has been a bear ward, someone whose job it is to train and care for bears. He has been a university and college teacher of English, acting, and culture and theater history, a professional actor, principally in Shakespeare, and all the plays he has acted in, some of which he has directed. He is a musician, playing the violin and percussion, studying conducting under John Avison, and composing and arranging for orchestra and for chamber and jazz ensembles. Crispin Jan Elsted received the 2015 Alcuin Society's Robert Reid Award for Lifetime Achievement in the Book Arts in Canada. Please help me welcome Crispin.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I promise not to throw anything at people who have to leave, and I hope I'm at a nice pause when that happens. I was telling Robert and Jill and various people that when I give lectures, I usually never know what I'm going to talk about until I stand up and start talking. This time, however, I have slides, and because of the slides, I've got a certain structure to the first part of the talk. But even then, I find that with the slide I've chosen to start with, it's rather like a large swimming pool. When I was young, I never learned to dive because I was mortally afeard of doing belly flops for obvious reasons. And so I perfected the cannonball, you know, the thing where you jump up in the air and sort of hug your knees and splash in wherever you happen to land. That was my best attempt at finesse in the swimming sports. So this talk is rather like that, and being here to talk partly about the Codex, or largely about the Codex, the book structure, I decided to start with this. Now, this is as good a place as any to start if you're talking about books, because frankly no one really knows where the Codex was first developed or what the first Codex was. And by Codex, just so that everyone's clear on this, by Codex I mean what we generally think of as a book. That is, a book that has a spine with pages that can be opened and the pages can be turned and moved back and forth sequentially. There are other kinds of books, of course, a series of tablets, fascicules, single pieces of paper in a box or some kind of container, scrolls. All of these are books, but the kind of book that we generally think of as a book is the Codex. Now, I often use this piece. This is something from our collection. This was a part of a Tuscan missal. It's an opening, two leaves of a Tuscan missal, written sometime around 1400 in Tuscany in Italy, probably in Florence. And I like to hand this around to people because it's very tough. It's lasted this long. You know. I like to hand this around to students and ask them to figure out what they can gather about this object. What is it about this object that tells us anything about what it is, what its function was, and whether it was part of anything else? And the first and obvious thing, of course, is the fold in the middle with the holes, which to anyone who's ever seen a book, and although today I sometimes wonder about some people because I don't think they ever have, if you have seen one, you'll recognize this as likely having been part of a book. It is in fact part of a missal, M-I-S-S-A-L, not the Trump kind. That is a book of the Mass. Missa in Latin is the Latin for Mass, which was used in an abbey church. And this is about so big, this piece. It would have sat as part of a much larger book, this sort of size, on a lectern, and 3 priests, a priest, a deacon, and a subdeacon, would have stood in front of it and would, amongst them, have spoken or sung through the Mass. One of the things that's interesting about this is you see this corner. It's, as opposed to the rest of the sheet, which is vellum, scraped calfskin, as opposed to the rest of the sheet, which is fairly stiff and rattly when you move it, this is very soft and malleable. Because, of course, it being such a large book, the subdeacon who was on the right would be the one who reached over and grabbed the corner of the page and turned the page at the end. And over the years, the grease from people's fingers has softened this so that it's become rather different in texture. You'll also notice, if you're trying to work out what this is, it's clearly something of some importance. If you don't happen to know anything about the Catholic Mass or the kind of church or liturgy that was used in those days or that kind of ceremony, you could still work out that people had taken a good deal of trouble with this. It's handwritten. It's on calfskin, which is not a usual kind of material these days anyway. It has music on it of a kind, you can see, which is written in neumes, which was a late medieval form of musical notation. And the whole thing gives a sense of occasion, somehow. These colored capital letters, for example, contribute to that. We know, even if we weren't told, we know that it comes from Tuscany if we happen to be paleographers, because we can identify the writing style. These rounded letters are very much like a northern Italian rotunda hand, which was very common in those monasteries. So here we have the stuff of a book, a basic example of a book before the printing press, 1400. So this was about 50 years, a little more than 50 years before Gutenberg's Bible was published in Mainz in 1452. If you look at early printed books, like Gutenberg's Bible, I have a slide of it, you'll see that the kind of type that was first developed was closely based on the sorts of letter forms that were used in these medieval manuscripts. Gutenberg's was based on Northern Italian, or Northern European hands, which tended to be of the kind of spiky, Gothic style that you sometimes see badly done on Christmas cards these days. For some reason or other, everybody seems to think that Christmas happened in 1300 and it was written about by monks. I don't know why. But books in Italy, early books in Italy, many of them used hands rather like this, although they very quickly changed to an alphabet which is much more like what we now are familiar with in the Roman alphabet that we use every day. Now, this is an opening. That is, it's not, this is one page, that's another page. The two pages together, when you open a book, is called an opening. And they form, within the Codex form, the book form, they form a unit together. It worked. This is the Van Graag canon for book page layouts. Van Graag was a typographer from Holland who, sometime in the early 20th century, decided that he wanted to work out just how it was that Gutenberg and the other early printers decided where to place their text matter on the page. It was very clear that from the beauty of the books and the balance of the pages and the openings when they're looked at, that Gutenberg and Manutius and all the other early printers understood that certain proportions needed to be maintained. This is based on what's called the golden mean. It's a very simple 3:4 ratio page, rectangle. And by means of drawing these lines, which you see in white, you arrive at the means to work out the two vertical areas outlined in yellow, which are the text areas of the page. Anyone who's, I assume there's some students here of book arts or book design, graphic design, are there? I see a show of hands. Two anyway, the rest of you are ashamed to admit it. Somebody's making notes, so you must be two. Anyway, if you're interested in finding out more about this, you can Google Van Graag and find it, or book page layouts and find it. It's not hard to discover. What's interesting about this is that the proportions of the type areas are in the same proportion as the page as a whole, the opening as a whole, such that, and this is the only thing there's a lot about it, but there's one thing that I'll tell you. The size of the length or the depth of the type area on each page is equal to the width of each page. So this yellow line here is equal to this, to the spine. And that proportion, that balance, that equilibrium, the two parts of the page, that is the opening itself and the text area, gives us a sense of balance. Now the other thing about it is, as you notice, that the type areas are up and toward the middle. And this is where we start talking, in my estimation about tonight anyway, this is how we start talking about form, structure. Because there are structures and forms in the arts, and I'm thinking about book printing and design now as an art, although really it's a craft. There are forms which are what I would call ineluctable, inescapable. Ineluctable is a word I like better, partly because hardly anyone knows what it means, so I could book learn it, and also because it has a very specific meaning. It comes from the Latin word illuctare, the verb which means to struggle to escape. And these forms, like this form of the book for the Codex, and other artistic forms like the sonata, the sonnet in poetry, the triptych in painting, various other forms, all of these are so well defined and established that once you start working with them, you have really to struggle to get away from them. They really do have a grip. But this is not a grip of some kind of intellectual tyranny or aesthetic force. This is a grip of necessity, a grip of convenience. For the poet, for example, writing a sonnet, you find yourself in a sonnet working in a form which has been refined and gradually worked and honed to perfection by a whole succession of poets and craftsmen to create a form which gives you elegant and particular opportunities. And the nature of the best forms in the arts are that they all contribute to giving us opportunities for very particular kinds of exploration, or just thinking about whatever subject it is, writing about whatever subject it is you're concerned with. They provide, if you like, a frame around a subject area or a discussion. Now, like all other forms in the arts, these particular forms, like the Codex, have gone through a succession of generations of use, beginning with uses which are very classically exact. This is, anyone know what this is? I know some of you aren't allowed to talk. We do. Any guesses? Well, this is an opening from the second volume of the Dove's Bible. This was a Bible that was printed in from 1902 to 1905 at the Dove's Press, which was run by a man named Thomas James Cobden Sanderson. Cobden Sanderson was an absolute purist when it came to the Codex form and to book printing, and he believed that there should be nothing whatever to distract the eye from the text. This meant that he was a very dull man in some respects, but his books are very elegantly beautiful, but after about 16 or 20 pages of reading them, I at least start to nod off, visually at least. One becomes tired of this utter perfection of form. He uses one, I photographed this particular page because it had a drop cap in red, and the only kind of elaboration or beauty in the whole Bible, not beauty, the only kind of elaboration or decoration, if you like, in the whole Bible are the drop caps in red, which appear one at the beginning of every book of the Bible, so you get 66 of those. And then in some of the parts of the Bible you get, which have sections within a book, you'll get smaller ones. So the book of Psalms, for example, which has 150 Psalms in it, has 150 very small red letters. I think Cobden Sanderson probably lost sleep over that, but he did it finally anyway, which is very good. He also eases the eye by setting verse, like the Psalms and the Song of Songs of Solomon, or the Song of Deborah. All these are set as verse with ragged lines on the right. So that also eases the eye somewhat as you're going through the book. But you have to get through the whole Pentateuch and 2 or 3 other books before you get to the Song of Songs, so it's still a long haul with this kind of work. Now, I'm being facetious deliberately because I think Puritanism in any form is a problem. Just look at the English Civil War, In fact, in a way, you could also look at Trump's America right now and see a similar kind of Puritanism, except that it isn't based on any rational thought, but never mind that. Some of you will be familiar with the Kelmscott Press of William Morris. I don't have a slide of it, but William Morris was publishing his books about 10 years before this. And the Kelmscott Press books are equally concerned with that sense of the area of the page being defined up in the end, so the opening is centered in a unit. But Morris loved decoration, and although by no means every page of his is decorated, many of them are. In the Kelmscott Chaucer, for example, which is about well over 400 pages, there are 86 openings which have a border, a heavy border around at least one of the 2 pages of the opening, beautifully engraved or drawn and designed borders with flowers and leaves winding through them. Very similar, in fact, to the books of hours, which you can see if you look at reproductions of facsimiles of medieval handwritten books of hours. These were books which were mostly devotional books concerned with the various prayers, the greater and lesser offices of the church, sometimes the offices of, or the sacraments of communion and so on, occasionally parts of the Bible, the Gospels, and they were heavily decorated because, and they were handwritten of course, because the decoration was essential to the sense of glorifying God in those cases. It was glorifying the text, and Morris was concerned, when he published his books, with glorifying the text he was concerned with. Why, after all, would you spend weeks and months and even years hand-setting, letter by letter, a particular book or writing it by hand if you didn't care about the text? Believe me, that's a slog. It's difficult to do because I've had to do it once or twice. So here we have this same form. Morris used it too, except that Morris's was more ornate on occasion. And Cobden Sanderson was a friend of Morris's. Well, he was a neighbor. Well, they knew one another. I'm not sure they were friends. Cobden Sanderson bound most of the Count Scott books. He was a binder initially. And he had the decency, at least, to wait until Morris died before he set up his own press and published books which were in every way in opposition, except sometimes in the choice of content, to the books which Morris published. One of the things about this, and one of the things about all these forms, are that they combine beauty with utility. This is a key thing about art forms. The greatest art forms are all useful. Those of you who know Horace, and I'm sure most of you do, Horace's Ars Poetica, which is one of the great poems of classical Latin literature, has in it a passage in which he talks to young poets about writing poetry or writing books of whatever kind, which provide useful information beautifully. And he says, if you make things that are useful and beautiful, utile dulci, if you use that kind of combination in your books, you'll be a bestseller, no problem. Well, a lot of the bestsellers today seem to me to disprove that, but I think Horace was right, really. And the usefulness of this is not simply that it draws the attention to the text and makes the text immediately available. It's also that in this very classical version of the Codex, it gives you lots of room around the text. Now, if you're holding a big book, your hands are usually at the bottom of it, and you need room for your thumbs and hands to hold the thing without obscuring the text. Also, in many books, particularly older ones, you sometimes see in booksellers' catalogs, this book is annotated by the owner. Now, if the owner happened to be a friend of the writer or an acknowledged expert in the field that the writer's writing about, then you would want that copy, because whatever comments such a person made would be of interest and would be worth looking at. And there's lots of room in the margins here to write such things. I annotate a lot of my own books at home, and using a pencil, of course, not a ballpoint or anything. And sometimes the remarks are rude, but those are, other people's, I'm never rude, but some annotated books you find have remarkably rude remarks by the writers. A particular example is Swinburne, who used to buy poems by his contemporaries and annotate them fiercely in the margin. He likened one poet to someone who was crouching beneath the, like the fox in the fable, he was crouching beneath the inaccessible vine of song. So he was just hopeless. He couldn't possibly get anywhere. So not a very nice man in some respects, but an acute critic, I think. Anyway, later on, this codex form has been used for centuries and still is used basically as the model for most of the books you buy. If you buy a book from a decent publisher like Knopf, for example, or Penguin, you'll find that although the page sizes are smaller, they don't have nearly as much extra paper around them. They are nevertheless adhering to that same notion. You can see it carrying through. This is a book from Thomas Mosher's press in Portland, Maine, published in the early 20th century. It's an edition of Walter Pater's The Renaissance, Studies in the Renaissance. And Pater's doing something, or Mosher is doing something here which is quite common was quite common in the 18th century and early 19th century particularly in liturgical books, devotional books, but became kind of a fad later on. And that is using rules to outline and accentuate the text area of the page. Also, as you see, he gives a separate little cartouche or box to the title, another little box for the page number, and then one thinks rather conveniently a little box in which you can write very small annotations on the margin if you want to. I can only see that that's the reason for it, apart from the fact that he wants to carry on the width of the number box there. It adds a nice quality of neatness to the page. In a way, it's unnecessary, but it does, I think, accentuate the pleasure that we have in such a form. However, you'll notice that the actual text area would begin here if it were the Dove's Bible, and instead of that, he's narrowed it even more. So it gives the page even more of that sense of upthrust into the center. It's a beautiful page, and very readable too. The man who not initiated this, but who was particularly fond of it was John Baskerville, the English 17th century English, 18th century? 18th century English printer, who designed his books often with rules as the borders, and if he didn't actually print them that way, very often other people would then draw rules around them. So it's very hard sometimes to find particular Baskerville books that aren't ruled, even if he initially printed them that way. Now, as I said, often, nearly always, in the course of the history of any art form, these structures start to be questioned. One of the great uses, in fact, of youth is that it questions its elders. And every artistic period that you come to finds that happening. You think of the difference between Alexander Pope and John Keats, for example, or even Wordsworth. If you think about what happened between the Georgian poetry in the early part of the 20th century and into the First World War, and Eliot's Wasteland, which was printed first in 1920 or 21, and you can see just a huge rending of any kind of association with that earlier generation. Now, in the case of Eliot, of course, the war had done enough tearing apart of society and life to accomplish this anyway, but Eliot clearly felt, as did his companions, that literature had to take a completely different course. We could no longer sound like people like Swinburne, for example, or even Rupert Brooke. We had to sound like somebody who lived in the 20th century and whose work and whose attention to subject was based on a new sensibility. In the 20th century, the book page and the organization of it has gone through a number of major changes, and the most important one was probably that of the Bauhaus school in Germany. This was a group of book designers, writers, typographers in Germany who decided that they wanted to liberate the page from this classical kind of impediment, and they also, as they saw it, and they also wanted to develop a sense of less symmetry or a different symmetry to the page. So instead of having everything nicely symmetrically organized with ratios that fit with one another, they began to do this kind of thing. Now, this is not, in fact, a Bauhaus book. This book was published about 10 years ago. It's by Matt Lohman. It's a book called Dutch Type, and it's about simply a history of Dutch typography in the 20th century. Now, I think no one would argue that this is a very beautiful page, and it has nothing to do with the Dove's Bible or the Van der Graaf, even though it's a Dutch type book. But the use of this asymmetrical arrangement is very cunningly done. You notice that on this side of the page, he has this enormous panel here with the large-sized letters set out diagrammatically. On this side, he has this lovely, rather traditional setting out of alphabets in various colors. So you get completely different objects, but each of them drawing an equal amount of attention on the page, so that you're, as it were, looking at the page as a whole and seeing something which balances from the outside in. You also have here this little panel at the bottom, balanced by the two panels about Scala and Scala Sans at the top. But they've completely given up the foot margin. The margin at the bottom of the page, what used to be called a headline, which was something which gives you the chapter name and the title of the book, is no longer at the top, it's at the bottom. And the page number is down in the corners. But then the book is about this size, and it's heavy. And how are you going to use a book like that? You've got to put it on a desk or on a lectern and turn the pages and look at it at something of a distance. It isn't the kind of book you sort of tuck down into an armchair with and read, you know. So in that sense, it's fulfilling its objective of being useful for the purpose for which it was intended, and at the same time offering a great deal more material on one opening than you would have in a classical book. If you tried to take all these things and put them into a book that was classically organized, it would probably take at least 2 openings to do it all, especially if you get the same sizes. You'd have to have a much bigger book, for one thing, or you'd have to reduce this to the point where it lost its impact. So it simply doesn't fit. In other words, it's not just that they are throwing stuff all over the page, It's that they have their material and they're creating a page which accommodates it. And it ends up being beautiful. Utile dulci, again, you've got the useful with the beautiful. Now, as well as doing things which grow like this, which grow from the classical Codex outline, grow from in the sense that they are obviously opposed to it and moving into something else. We also have all sorts of experiments, and I've brought a few to show you. This is a book which is devised, as far as its page sizes and everything is concerned, on the same ratios as the Dove's Bible. In fact, this is about the same size, the page size. However, the page is not used the same way at all. Now, what is this book? This is a book called Venice. It's published by the Whittington Press in Gloucestershire in England, one of the great private presses these days. And it celebrates the city of Venice through a great number of wood engravings by John Craig, who spent years visiting Venice every year and engraving various scenes from it. Not just scenes, but little bits and pieces. This little fish, for example, and just plates of food and all kinds of things. And then there are also vistas on some of the other pages of the canals and so forth. And John, when he was doing these engravings, wrote notes in a notebook in a rather loose structure. And the text of this book is his notebooks. So what we have is that sense of the artist wandering around the streets and the canals and the Fondazioni of Venice and looking at all the views and sitting down and drawing something which strikes him and making a few notes about it. It's a very loose agglomeration of impressions of the city. And John Randall, who designed the book and printed it, has used that to give himself permission, as it were, to let the text flow with the images. So you get it flowing right through the gutter of the book, from one corner down to the other. And he's just arranged some of the objects that are being talked about, some of the engravings, around that. So in fact, the textual area of this book is a kind of big diagonal that goes from one corner down to the other. Other pages from the book, which I don't have, look completely different. In fact, there are no two openings which look anything like the same. And yet they are constrained, I would say, or contained at least, within that traditional Codex ratio. And as such, we feel comfortable with it. There is something about it which we're used to. And each page is so well designed. John is a brilliant designer. Each page is so well designed that we never for a moment wonder where we're supposed to start on the page or where the text is or anything else. We just flow through with it. It's a very kind of fanciful, I'm tempted to say liquid kind of flowing through the book. It's quite wonderful. So this is, again, rather classical in its structure, even though it isn't classical at all in its appearance. Here we have a different kind of opening. This is from a book that we're in the middle of doing. This is why it's a sheet not bound up. This is a book we're just finishing now, or Jan is just finishing while I'm having fun in Edmonton. This is a book called Resistive Graphicus, Typographic Bears. Our press device at Barbarian Press is a bear doing something. Usually, sometimes just a bear standing there, sometimes it's a bear printing or a bear doing something rude with Jan. In one case, we published some erotic poems, and that was what turned out. Anyway, when we ask an engraver to illustrate a book, we ask him or her to do a version of our press device in whatever way they like. They have a completely free way. And this book collects about 20 of the first 20 that we have of these. It's the 40th anniversary of our press this year, so we're printing this book as a kind of celebration and a little history. This is Barry Moser's engraving for our press. And as you see, it's a facsimile, or a kind of a trompe l'oeil of a bear on a block that's been engraved on a block being inked by an ink roller. So the book it's a landscape format, you notice. So the first thing you notice about it, in fact, if you're talking about page structure, I'm sorry, I should be standing in front of it. When you're talking about page structure, is that instead of having a vertical impact, it has a horizontal one. The spine, obviously, is here, just to make it clear. Now there are two possibilities. When you're doing a landscape book, they're interesting to design. Those of you who do design books should do one for an exercise if you don't have the opportunity to do it for money. You can obviously set text that goes right across the type area. And by the way, the type area in this is devised from the same Decra process that the earlier drawing I showed you was. But in using it on this size of a sheet, you get a completely different ratio of areas. You still have a large foot margin, and you still have a decent gutter and head and fore-edge, but those three are almost all the same. And the more you go to landscape, the more those shrink and the bigger the foot margin becomes. It's quite interesting. So one thing you can do is you can set the text right the way across so that you read this way, all the way over. In which case, if it's at all a big page, and this is not a big book, it's about so. If it's at all a big page, you have to make very sure that the leading between the lines is such that the eye will follow back to the next line properly, because if they're too close together, there's quite an easy likelihood of the reader getting to the end of the line, going and reading the same line again, which is intensely irritating, I have to, as you probably know. Badly designed books often contribute to that problem. The other thing, of course, is to break it in columns, which is what I decided to do for most of the text of the book. Each of these is a little essay about a particular engraver under discussion, and all of them fit on 2 or 3 columns. Those which have only enough for 2 columns have the engraver's name and the titles of the books in which his particular, her particular device appear, where that one is. But the text starts over here at the same level as it would be if it were underneath the titles, if you see what I mean. So the text starts at a slight drop in that column, and the rest of this page is blank except for the engraving. So the columns are still there in, as it were, in the memory, in the address of the page, even though they aren't always printed, all 3 of them. And at no point are 4 of them printed at all. The preface and the afterwards of the book, which are the explanatory parts, are printed all the way across. So I had a chance to play with both uses of the landscape format. Those of you who subscribe to the press will have this, I think, before Christmas, if we're lucky. If the power has come back on, it was out when I left yesterday. I left my Jan in wonderful situation. No power, no warmth in the house, howling wind, trees all around everywhere on the road. And so, you know, I'm a kind man that way. Anyway, so that's another way of looking at a book page. Now we talk about structures. Now the structure, as we've said, of a codex is very basically a spine to which the edges of the sheets of the book are attached such that they can be turned. And that's about the only thing about this that you can see that's at all conventional, because there is a spine, it's here, where the angles come in. But the book is diamond shaped. The pages of the book are all die cut into different shapes, and they're all different colors and different papers. Now, why in hell would anyone do this? Well, the reason is that it's a poem called Aunt Sally's Lament by Margaret Kaufman, an American poet. And the book was designed by Claire Van Fleet, who, at the Janus Press, who's a Canadian, born in Canada, but has worked all her life in Vermont. And Claire is, I think, one of the most brilliant book designers in the world. She's astonishing. She's designed everything from the absolutely classical codex to things that are much wilder than this. And she's happy in all of them, and all of them work. It's amazing. The reason she did this book this way is because the text of the book is a poem about an old woman, very old woman, sitting in her garden, and she's a quilter. She's been a quilter all her life. And she's remembering, in her old age, one summer afternoon in the garden, she's remembering that many, many years before, a silk salesman came along and sold her silk, and a lot more. And they had a relationship, more like an affair. And then he took off, and she never saw him again. And this is a little poem about her bitterness and her sadness and her loneliness about this having happened, Aunt Sally's Lament. The poem consists of a number of 4-line stanzas. You can see one of them here. Each opening has one of these stanzas. They begin at the top and they move around with every opening, every time you turn a page. And at the end of every stanza, there's a little comment off to the side. Yes, indeed. So see, this one says, ah. Another one somewhere says, damn man. And there are various other things. They're all different. And as the book's pages are turned, all of those are left open so you can see them. Pages are increasingly cut away so that by the time you turn to the last page of the book, you have a whole halo of these little remarks around the last stanza of the poem. The shapes of the pages, of course, are based on quilting shapes. Darts, arrows, triangles, circles, all the things, not circles in this case,
No.
but all the patterns which are traditional in quilting and used in various ways, star shapes and so on, triangles. And the book itself is not sewn. It turns like a Codex in the normal way, but if you want to, you can slip the tab out of the front cover and the whole book pulls out to about 8 feet long and they all lie together like a long line. And then you can put it back together. So it's both a Codex and what's called a lazaretto? No, that's something else entirely. What the hell is it called? A leporello. I knew it was something like that. I knew it wasn't a pasta, that much I remember. A leporello, which is an accordion book, as we sometimes call it. Yeah. So it's a combination of the two. But again, the structure is still there. It's aware of the tradition, but it's breaking the bounds as many ways as it can. Here we have another way of playing around with structure. This is a book called The New World Suite by Robert Bringhurst. Some of you may know him as a typographer. He wrote The Elements of Typographic Style, which is the vade-mecum for anyone. That is the book you must have if you're interested in typography or design. It's the greatest book on design since Daniel Updike's book in the 20s, Printing Types. The Elements of Typographic Style. Write it down if you're a student and don't already have it. Robert, however, is also a brilliant poet, one of the best in the country, and he became interested years ago in writing for multiple voices to read. Robert is much more convinced by oral poetry than he is by poetry to be read silently on the page. In this case, he's following a path that he'd been following for some years. His first attempt, well, it's not an attempt, it's a success, but his first poem with multiple voices was for 2 voices. It was called Blue Roofs of Japan. And we, in fact, published it. And it was interesting to try to find a way of putting on the page the effect of these 2 voices, which sometimes speak over one another. Initially, I thought, well, I'll put one voice in black, and then I'll have a transparent Japanese paper, because it was called Blue Roofs of Japan, so that made sense, with the other voice on that. And when you put them down, you'll be able to read one through the other page. But the problem was that one paper was so flimsy and the other so relatively heavy that the book was impossible to handle. It just was, it was awful. So I threw that idea out, together with the model book I'd made. And instead of that, I ended up printing the first voice in ink on one page, and the second voice in ink on the second page, and then overprinting in blind, that is without ink, on the paper, so that the voice that you are hearing as you hear this voice is is impressed into the paper, but isn't actually printed in ink on the same page. So you're aware of it as you read the ink, and you can read it when it isn't underneath the ink, but you aren't bothered. You can read it easily, but you aren't bothered by it as you're reading each voice in ink. Is that clear?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm glad, because I'm puzzled. So, in this case, this is a poem for 3 voices, and it's very complex. I can tell you this because when Robert first wrote it in the mid-90s, I think, Robert and a friend of ours who's an actress and myself gave a reading of it at the Vancouver Literary Festival, and we rehearsed it for about a month. There was also music involved in that, which was, I think, misguided. We rehearsed it and got it down absolutely pat, and there were absolutely very refined, very minute, small half-second intervals that had to be counted in. It was very difficult. And I remember we had each of us highlighted, our parts in an orange highlight pencil, pen, those things, those disfigure books that students have all the time. When we went in to read it in the auditorium, we discovered that they had amber gels on the lights, so all the highlighting disappeared. And somehow we got through it. I don't know. I think we got someone to throw a couple of blues in to see if we could bring it up a bit, and we managed. Anyway, I had played around with ideas for this, but finally Robert it was taken by a press in New York, the Center for the Book in New York City, and they produced this edition. Now, here you have it as you see it when you first see it on the table. It's got a black base, it's about this big, right? And it has 4 books which lie across one another and are hinged from each of the 4 sides. This top one hinges out this way, it flops down completely over 180 degrees, and then opens into a book against this sloped surface here. And then the next one flops over that way, and then one over that way, and then one over that way. So there are 4 books attached to the central structure. And when it's open, it looks like this. Voice 1, Voice 2, Voice 3, and this is a book of sort of essays and commentary on the poem, notes and so forth. Now, why did he do it this way? Well, the obvious reason is that if people are reading a poem like this together, it's rather like, you know, people used to get together and play Trivial Pursuit or something, right? So this is the Trivial Pursuit of the literati. Right? You get a copy of this, and you sit down with three friends around a table, and you open it up and you read the poem together. You can look at one another and take cues from one another, and each of these parts of the top three has all three of the voices printed. The one in black is the one that you're reading if you're sitting at that side or that side. And the pale orange and pale blue voices are the other two. And they're printed almost over one another, partly over. The orange is about halfway down into the letter of the black, and the blue about halfway up into it. But they're so pale that they don't interfere with reading the black. And at the same time, you know exactly where they've come in and where you'd come in relation to them. It's brilliant. As a structure, it's based very heavily on a Renaissance idea. In the Renaissance, people either read this poem or played Trivial Pursuit. They used to get together and sing madrigals. And they had sheets of paper. Madrigals were printed on big sheets of square paper. And each voice, if it were a four-part madrigal, the music and the text would be on one side, and then for another and another and another. So you could sit around or stand around if you had a high desk and have your music and sing and watch one another for cues. And it's a delightful idea. And here it is resurrected for a completely different purpose. Now you notice that despite the fact that this structure is unusual to say the least, and very much purpose-built, this looks much more like a Dove's Press page than anything you've seen since this evening, right? So Robert is keenly aware of the classical tradition of the Codex, but he uses the structure of the book and the use of the way the book is presented in a completely different way. So we've seen a number of different kinds of books done in different ways. It might be just a good idea to have a reminder of what we think of as book. These are two first editions of Dickens, printed in the 1840s, 1850s, and this is what books looked like then. These were, as it were, the paperbacks at the time. They weren't terribly expensive even then, although the only people who could afford them were not working class, but somewhere higher up. They were, by the way, atrociously printed and on very bad paper with lousy ink. Fortunately, Dickens is well worth reading, so people persevered. But it's a surprise to me that most of the reading public of the 19th century were blind by the time they were 30, because the type, it's difficult to tell from this because you don't know the proportions, but these are large octavos, so they're about this size, right? The type is very narrow, quite skinny, because they wanted to get as many letters as possible onto a line in order to save cost, and because paper was expensive and so on and so on. So the type is very, very skinny. The ink that they were using in those days, because they were printing now from power presses, not from hand presses anymore, so the books were being printed very fast because there was a growing reading public and they needed more of them. This is the beginning of mass production. It's also the beginning of the problem of mass production, which we're all aware of. So the ink that they used in the presses had to be, it couldn't be that stiff, wonderful, tacky black ink that we use or other presses that print letterpress use. It had to be sort of gloppy stuff. And it was made from coal tar derivatives. Now coal tar has all kinds of acids in it, right? And this paper was early wood pulp paper. It wasn't made from rags anymore because that was expensive. Wood pulp paper has lignum in it, and lignum is acid. So what happens is with these 19th century books, as Mr. Demberg will tell you if you ask him, head of special collections here, 19th century books are slowly eating themselves to death on the shelf. Many of them are just falling apart, and there are so many of them, and it's so expensive to take the book down, wash it, put it back to buffer the acid and put it back together again, that it's simply not worth doing for most of them. So they're simply disappearing. They're being digitized in most libraries so that the text at least is preserved. So they're horrible things in many ways, but those of us who were lucky enough to have copies that are actually readable still, rejoice in them simply because of their place in the history of things. And this is, if you like, the precursor of the modern hardback bestseller book. It's 165 or 70 years old now, but it's still, it's a book we all know. Just as we know this to be a book. Now, I don't know how easily any of you are offended, but I find it very difficult to be polite about this kind of thing. And I have a personal experience with this object, because about 10 years ago, I was one of a jury of 3 or 4 judges in Toronto to judge a lot of printed material and book material and so forth for a traveling exhibition, which was going back and forth across the country. There were a number of sections, so there were artist books, there were fine books, fine printed books, there were bindings, there were works for paper, there were all sorts of things related to the book arts generally. But this was, of course, in the artist book category, and this is where I have to be careful not to be rude. I don't know what the hell this is about, frankly. What it is, as you can probably tell, is a skein or a tangle of the telephone wire that they use, for electronics, different colored wires, which admittedly are quite pretty, the colors, I mean, tangled up and woven together in some way, not in any discernible pattern that I could see. I actually know how to knit, and there's no relation to knitting in this. But it is arranged in this kind of serpentine, or as I prefer to think of it, tapeworm form. And then attached to various parts of it are little bits of paper, each of which has a word. This says formula, that one says intermediates. That one says organization, which is ironic. Visualization, or visual effect, well, maybe. Anyway, this is the kind of thing that people who are, how do I put this politely, not heavily connected with literacy, like to do. Now, one of the interesting things about this whole process, and I say process in the sense of digestive process, was that one of the other judges was one of those chaps who was terribly nice. I mean, he really was. I liked him very much. But he hadn't a brain in his head. His notion was that if, we came on this thing, and I say came on in the sense that one comes on something that's been dropped on a trail by somebody, we came on this thing, and I said something rude, that's not a book. And he said, of course it is. And I said, what the hell do you mean? He said, well, because he said it was a book. The guy who made it said it was, so it's a book. Go figure. I mean, there's no possible way of dealing with this kind of discussion, right? Anyway, it didn't get a prize. It didn't get any exhibition. I like to think it was largely because of me. Here's another one from the same lot. Now this, I find myself being kind in relation to the last thing about this. At least this has sort of pages,
Yes.
However, I'm delighted to tell you, these are pieces of broken mirror, right, sandwiched between heavy wire and then attached to one side, so they kind of turn. It's a deeply reflective book. I'm delighted, and this is rather unkind of me, that the chap who said it was a book because the guy said it was a book cut himself on this. we had to be busy about Band-Aids and Dettol for a while. But it didn't seem to change his mind. Some people are completely impenetrable, but fortunately not uncuttable, that's all right. Anyway, here it is, the book, number 2. What else can you say? Number 2. There's a clue there. Anyway, it's what some people are doing these days. Now, having said that, just to be serious, the whole artist book phenomenon, because it is a phenomenon, is terribly interesting, and I mean this quite seriously, because there are many, many people doing what they call themselves book objects in this kind of experimental way, which are actually quite fascinating and very beautiful. My problem with it is that they aren't books, and there is this whole question of, we have language so that we can say that this is that and this is something else, and it helps us keep our way, keep track, of what's going on in our lives. With this, it's difficult to do that, and my own sense of it is that not these two, but many of the ones that I have seen, and I doubt that you've seen them too, are quite beautiful objects, but they're more sculptural than they are textual. They're certainly not textual, most of them at all. Most of them are highly visual, which is fine. But they're sculptural, they're kinetic, they have dimensionality to them. There are all kinds of things which recommend them to the eye, particularly, and to thinking, too, because some of them are very thoughtful and very beautifully made. But at the moment, we're in that kind of odd interregnum between the classical book and something which is emerging out of it. And I think that possibly this has to do with rather the same thing that happened in very general terms when photography came in at the end of the 19th century, when it really began to blossom. And the necessity of painters to paint portraiture, for example, initially, or realistically, was not as necessary anymore as it had been. And I think it's no sort of coincidence that when photography suddenly became a very important part of culture, that things like Impressionism and Fauvism and Cubism and so on began to emerge. In a way, the artists were free to move other ways on the canvas and do different things. I think that's a reasonably healthy way to think about it. And I think maybe this is the same kind of process with the book. That at the moment, we're in that interregnum where these are not books, but they're not quite anything else either yet. They're growing through some process. And that eventually they'll arrive at a point where they will see themselves as distinct from printing of the kind that we do, and simply as another area of art, which of course is to be celebrated. It's after all a good thing. Having said all that and gone through all that, let's just remind ourselves of this, because I think it's important. And talk about another art form entirely. How am I doing for time? All right? When do I have to shut up?
6:50, fairly soon.
I have 10 minutes? This is impossible. No, I'll do what I can. What I was going to do, and what I will do very quickly with one piece, is talk about the sonnet. The sonnet, just as the Codex, is one of these ineluctable forms, a form which you have to struggle to get away from. This kind of struggle we were just looking at in a way. The sonnet is one of those forms which also grew out of accumulative experience and experimentation by great poets and some poets not so great, to arrive at a form which was particularly useful, a form which could answer beautifully and adapt beautifully to any number of problems. And one of them, the kind that one you may know very well, Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, is an example. Now, the thing about the sonnet is that it's arranged, let's look at another one first. This is Donne's number 10 from the Holy Sonnets. A Petrarchan sonnet. This is the original Italian form which was brought into England and into English. And the Petrarchan sonnet, how many of you remember this from high school? Not a soul, not a sausage. Oh, there's one waving back there, right? You see, what people, they go to high school, they get all this stuff, and then they forget it 2 days later, right?
14 lines.
Pardon me?
I said it's 14 lines, right?
14, oh, no, not 14 lines, you just counted them.
No,
14 lines, no,
that.
I know. Sonnets almost always have 14 lines, and the Petrarchan sonnet is arranged particularly in 2 groups of lines, 8 and 6, all right? The first 8 lines run through 2 rhymes only, A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. That is, the first and the 4th lines rhyme, the 2nd and 3rd, and the 5th and the 8th line rhyme with the 1st and the 4th. So A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. And then the last 6 lines have a number of different patterns for rhyming. Men, dwell, well, then, li, di, die. That's a half rhyme. Okay, what's interesting is this proportion here. In this sonnet, I'll read it to you, just so you have a sense of it. Listen to what he's saying and the way in which he's putting his argument. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee to go, rest of their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke. Why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Now, it's a poem which is an address to death himself. Death is personified and death is being addressed. In the first 8 lines, he's talking about death as a phenomenon of humanity. We all go through it, we all have to die. But at the same time, death is a metaphor for many things that we admire, like sleep and rest. And so why should we be afraid of it? And then he tightens up the argument, raises his voice, gets a little bit, angry, and he starts basically ticking death off. Now, you're a slave. You're a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Any of these people, kings can have men executed. Desperate men will kill people in the course of a crime. Chance happens, we have accidents and we die. Fate, we're fated sometimes to have bad luck. All these things they're nothing to do with you, death. You don't have anything to do with them, they just fall in your lap. Big deal, right? And he goes through this way, kind of insulting death, and gets to the end, and points out that if, in Christian terms, Donne was a priest of the Anglican Church, that in Christian terms we die and then we wake eternally and we won't die again. And death, you'll die, you won't be around, you'll have no power. So you have an argument which is gradually intensified as it goes on. And it's the more intense because the latter part of it is only 6 lines instead of 8, so you have to tighten it up, use fewer words, punch more, It's like the closing moments of a boxing match. Now, Shakespeare, because he was English, and in English it's much harder to rhyme than it is in Italian, when he wrote this poem and his other sonnets, devised a different way of doing it. Instead of having 8 and 6, he had 3 quatrains, 3 4-line stanzas, and a couplet. Still 14 lines. And in this particular one, which is a masterpiece, and I don't care if I go past 1/4 I'm going to talk about this. In this poem, this is absolutely magnificent. Some of you may, if you're very lucky, may never have read this or heard it. So I'm saying to you, this is one of the great moments in English poetry. So even those of you who think this is silly, just listen and take it away. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare, ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. Now the poem is addressed by a man to a much younger woman who is his lover. The notion of it is a set of 3 metaphors, each of a process in time. And we get the same effect as we get in Donne, in that the poem gradually narrows its scope as it goes along. In the first 4 lines, he's talking about the whole year, a season of the year. So we're looking at autumn now, late autumn even. The leaves are blowing off the trees, the branches are bare again, it's growing cold. Like old age, my age. At 70, this means more to me than it will to anyone here at 18 or 20. A lovely moment, by the way, the image of the bare ruined choirs, which works perfectly well if we think of them simply as the birds being the choirs sitting in the branches of these barren trees. But there was an extra level of this for Shakespeare. Shakespeare's family was Catholic. His mother was an Arden, and the Ardens were Catholics before and after Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. But in many areas of the Midlands where Shakespeare lived, and the areas between that and London, there were ruined abbeys which had been destroyed by Henry VIII's troops when he dissolved the monasteries and threw the Catholic Church out and took over and created the Church of England. The choirs of an abbey, the choir of an abbey is the front part of the church near the altar where the choir, the monks sat and sang the office, sang the mass, and whatever else was being sung. So the ruined choirs could equally be these abbey stones. So there's no way the death of a kind of religion or a tradition as well in this. So it's big stuff, the year, the tradition, and so on. The second quatrain, we're in one day now. Not a year, but just one day. It's twilight. Such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, that dusky, lovely light you get after the sun's gone down, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self. Death was a thing that these people played around with a lot, and it was often spoken of as night being the little brother of death, sleep being death's son. These images come in all over the place. Here it is again. So the day, I'm like somebody, a day is coming to an end, and the sun's gone down, and soon it'll be night, and I'll be dead. The third one is very, very close. The third one is the speaker on his deathbed, and he's like the fire in his room. Now remember, in the Elizabethan times, very often a person was conceived, lived and conceived his own children, and died in the same bed. Beds were things that were passed on from one generation to another. So here we have a man lying on his deathbed, and there's a fire in his room, and the fire is dying down. And as the fire dies down, the ashes, which are the ashes of the wood which originally fed it, have now burned down, and they're now smothering the fire. This is a cycle. And at the same time, we have the man lying in the bed in which he was conceived, dying in the same bed. He gained life there, and he dies there. So it's within an hour, or within a few minutes even, that this particular perspective is taken. And then he says all these three things, these three metaphors, making them more and more immediate and more personal and painful, really, as they go along. And then in the couplet at the end, he then breaks away and addresses the woman and says, you know all this thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well, that is to love me well, whom thou must leave ere long, because I'm going to die before you do. It's a beautiful piece. And the thing about it is that the sonnet is ideally suited to such an argument. It's not as if Shakespeare chose the sonnet because he happened to be writing sonnets. It seems to me that had he wanted to write this poem, he inevitably would have written it this way, because this is the perfect form for any number of things. And just to give you, excuse me, to give you one other quick example. Here we have E.E. Cummings. Now, when I was about 12, when I first encountered Cummings' poetry, I thought the man was bloody mad. You know? I looked at this stuff on the page, no capital letters, punctuation all over the place. I don't understand what he's talking about. And it was my father who said, well, hang on, don't have a connection fit. This is a sonnet. And I was saying, what sonnet? And he pointed out to me, well, it is. It's basically it's a Shakespearean sonnet. It has, although the lines are somewhat broken up, it has 4 lines divided with one apart from it, and then 4 lines in the middle, another 4 lines with one apart, and then a couplet. And he's developing an argument, and it's an argument about heroism, and the fact that much of it is sham. Listen, why must itself, up every of a park anus, stick some, quote, statue, unquote, to prove that a hero equals any jerk who was afraid to dare to answer no? Quote, citizens, unquote, might otherwise forget, to err is human, to forgive divine, that if the, quote, state, unquote, says kill, killing is an act of Christian love. Nothing, in 1944 AD, can stand against the argument of military necessity, generalissimo E. And Echo answered, there is no appeal from reason, Freud. You pays your money and you doesn't take your choice. Ain't freedom grand? Now, 1944, middle of the war, America had gone in. Cummings was a pacifist, been a pacifist all his life. In the First World War, he refused to join up, and he drove an ambulance in the ambulance corps in France. Ended up in a military prison because a friend of his was writing anti-political letters back to the States, and they thought they were traitors, so they threw them in prison for about 6 months. And Cummings wrote a magnificent novel called The Enormous Room, which you should read if you're interested in him or the period. So this attitude is something that Cummings had lived with all his life. But again, you have a similar kind of development. You're talking about the public figure of a park, right? And then the individual human citizen who is told to kill and goes to kill because he's told to do so by his government. So it's moved from the public area to the individual area. And then you have the great voices of the time. Generalissimo E is Eisenhower, of course, who was at that time the head of the Allied forces in Europe and led D-Day, and later, of course, the president. And Freud, you all know. And these are actual quotes from both of them. And then his final thing, he moves into this kind of slang that we're all familiar with. He pays your money and he doesn't take your choice. Ain't freedom grand? If you look at the rhymes, they're half rhymes, but they're all there. So here we have another example, like what Claire Van Fleet did with Anseli's Lament compared to the Dove's Bible, what this is compared to Shakespeare. A similar structure, pushed at the envelopes, pushed at the edges, but still recognizably a sonnet and still functioning the same way. So these forms, had I another couple of hours, I'd talk about it much more. The ballad stanza, for example, or the canon in music, or the sonata form in music is a very good one. These are all forms which have been devised, as I said at the beginning, by craftsmen and artists over a period of time through experiment and through wisdom and through accumulated experience to be particularly useful in particular ways. And they are, for that reason, both inviolable and inescapable. So when you go home tonight, don't haul out an e-reader, haul out a book.
Yes.
Okay? Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions or brickbats, I'll be happy to either answer them or dodge, depending on whichever it is.
Could you stay for another few hours or something?
Oh, yeah, sure.
To us? Are there any questions?
I must have said it all. Oh, yes.
I'd like to make a comment.
Ah,
All of you in the future, subscribe to Bookbarian Press. You cannot get a more beautifully, well thought out, tactile experience than to hold one of Crispin's books. They
Thank you,
are.
Margaret. I didn't pay her to do this.
So, I'm taking him for dinner.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Yeah.
No,
Thank you.
they're awesome, awesome. And I'm a librarian, so that's
So you
my
know.
trade. That's my craft.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Right. You all want your dinner. I understand that.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.